Okay, so welcome to this Zoom class on sacred cities or cities that are considered to have special and unique spiritual standing for believers of a variety of religious traditions. So over the next 4 weeks, we're going to be touring 4 of these cities, namely, if you see on the upper left-hand side of the screen, Rome, then next to that, Jerusalem, then on the bottom, Damascus, and then next to that, Varanasi. I would imagine that probably most people here are maybe familiar with Rome and Jerusalem, probably not so much with Damascus and Varanasi. I don't know that, but I would assume that is the case. So in each of these classes, we're going to be looking briefly at the history of each city, very briefly, and then looking at a number of its sacred sites with numerous images to go along with my narration. So let us begin with Rome, also known as the Eternal City. Geographically, Rome is located in the central western portion of the Italian peninsula. You can see it there on the left, along the shores of the Tiber River. Rome is often referred to as the city of 7 hills that constituted the city when it was first created. And you can see them here. The 2 of the most famous are the Capitoline Hill and the Palatine Hill. And in between those 2 hills is where you find the Forum. So Rome's history spans 28 centuries. Its founding is said to be, at least traditionally, 753 BCE. But archaeologists actually believe that the site has been inhabited for much longer than that, making it a major human settlement for almost 3 millennia, and consequently one of the oldest continuous occupied cities in Europe. The most famous foundation myth, and perhaps the most famous myth in all of Roman mythology, is related to Romulus and Remus, the twins who were nursed by the she-wolf. The boys later were said to be descendants of Aeneas. Who was Aeneas? Aeneas was a prince of Troy who escaped the city after the Greeks had destroyed it. If you know the story of the Trojan horse, it's found in the Iliad. He was able to escape. In this painting from the 17th century, he has his older father on his back. And the story, at least the myth, was that he escaped, eventually wound up in Italy after spending some time with Queen Dido in Carthage, which there's a very famous opera about the tragedy of Dido, and that his descendants were the twin boys, Romulus and Remus. So at a later date, they decide to build a city after they grow up, and then Romulus killed his brother. This is a classic mythological story of brothers killing each other. Remember Cain and Abel? Well, here we have Romulus killing Remus and then founding the city of Rome, which is therefore named after him. Rome comes from Romulus. Later historians actually don't see this as mythological. They actually think the city was probably founded by Greeks, and that later when the need came for a mythological foundation myth, the Roman mythologists were able to create this. Whatever the case, the city's early population originated from a mix of Latins, that's from the area of Latium around Rome, Etruscans, from the area around what is today's Tuscany, and the Sabines from the central Apennine Mountains. So eventually, and we're going to skip a lot of history here very quickly, eventually the city became in succession the capital of the Roman kingdom ruled by kings, the 7 kings of Rome. That was from 753 to 509. Then the Roman Republic, under the rule of an aristocratic elite. That was 509 to 27 BCE. And finally, the Roman Empire, under the control of an emperor and supported institutions, which lasted from 27 BCE to 480 CE. And as a result, Rome has been regarded as the first Western imperial city and metropolis. It was first called the Eternal City by the Roman poet Tibullus in the 1st century BCE. After the fall of the empire in the West, which marked the beginning of what we call the Middle Ages, Rome slowly fell under the political control of the papacy. And in the 8th century, it became the capital of the Papal States. You can see the Papal States on the right here. There's the emblem on the left. All this yellow area were the Papal States, and those lasted until 1870. So when we think of the Papal States, we don't just think of Rome initially. It was all this area up in here. Then during the Renaissance, we had a large number of popes, 18 actually, over 2 centuries, who pursued architectural programs that aimed at making the city an artistic and cultural center of the world. So much of the great architecture and art began with the Renaissance. And as a result, famous artists, painters, architects made Rome the center of their activity, Michelangelo, Bernini, etc. Then between 1859 and 1870, what we call Italian unification took place, with Rome becoming the capital of the Kingdom of Italy. So you see the 2 maps here, 1858. By 1870, Italy had been pretty much united under this king, Victor Emmanuel II. So this is called the unification of Italy. And then, soon after World War I, Rome witnessed the rise to power of Italian fascism, led by the gentleman on the left, Benito Mussolini, who in 1922, at the request of King Victor Emmanuel III, so there was still a monarchy, marched on the city, eventually declaring a new empire and allying Italy with Nazi Germany. The interwar period saw a rapid growth of the city, and its population surpassed 1 million. On February 11th, and this is important for Rome, 1929, there was what is known as the Lateran Treaty between the Holy See, that is the Vatican, and the Kingdom of Italy. It was signed by Mussolini on behalf of King Victor Emmanuel III. What did the treaty do? It became effective on June 7th, 1929, and it established the independent state of Vatican City. And here you can see Vatican City, which still exists to this day as an independent state, and granted Roman Catholicism special status in Italy. On June 5th, 1944, Rome became the first capital of the Axis powers to fall to the Allies. And in 1946, the monarchy was abolished and an Italian republic was created, which exists to this day with a democratic parliamentary form of government. And there you have the history of Rome in 10 minutes. So obviously you can take a lifetime studying all of this, but just to give you a general sort of scope going from the foundation right up to modernity. Okay, let's now turn to some of the sacred sites in Rome. And it's been the home of two sacred traditions. Ancient Roman religion was a form of pagan polytheism. And here I'm not using the word pagan in a derogatory sense, which it has tended to be used as pagan. All it means is pre-Christian. So Roman religion was pre-Christian. And of course, the second major tradition was Christianity in the form of Roman Catholicism. So Roman religion was based on a number of gods, polytheistic, who had power over human beings and thus needed to be propitiated through sacrifice and worship. And here we see four of the most famous. The three on your left are known as the Capitoline Triad, three. In the middle sits Jupiter. On his left and your right is his wife, Juno. And on his right and your left is Minerva. Now, some of you may be aware that in Greek religion, Jupiter was Zeus, Juno was Hera, and Minerva was Athena, because the Romans sort of adopted much of the Greek polytheistic religion and gave new names to the gods. And then the fourth, very powerful and important god, was Mars. And they were all worshipped along with numerous other gods at temples on Capitoline Hill, which you've seen before. Capitoline Hill is up here, the furthest little orange spot on the left. And there's an image of it. So as all religions do, Rome maintained within the city numerous sacred sites, and the ruins of many of these still remain today. So let's visit a few of these more famous locations. So it needs to be understood that to ancient Romans, the city itself was considered sacred space based on its founding myth, whereby, as we have seen, it was established by Romulus with the support of the gods. And there are specific locations which reflect this idea. First, there's what we have known as the lapis niger, or black stone. It's an ancient shrine in the Roman Forum. If you go to the Forum today, you can see this. It was celebrated as the tomb of Romulus and constitutes the only surviving remnants of the old Comitium, as it was known, which was an early assembly area that predated the Forum, probably goes back to the 7th or 8th century BCE. The black marble paving and the modern concrete enclosure overlie an ancient altar and a black stone containing one of the earliest known Latin inscriptions, dated to about 550 BCE. Now, this is not the Latin that we know. This is almost a pre-Latin Latin, and it's very hard, it's been very difficult to translate, partly because some of the text runs left to right, others runs right to left, words that are no longer used, but essentially it's a curse. It's a curse to anyone who might violate the tomb or shrine. And that was quite common in ancient times, because tombs would often be violated because of the wealth they had within them. So this was a curse was in the black stone. Another famous spot location is known as the Umbilicus Urbis Romae. You can see an umbilicus as in umbilical cord, literally the navel of the city of Rome. It was a monument in the Forum, which designated the symbolic center of the city, and from which all measurements to and from Rome were calculated. It's the idea that this is the center of civilization, this spot right here with this plaque. Now, this is all that remains of what was once a pretty nice monument, but it goes to show with time, everything eventually changes and falls apart. But this was, you can still visit this spot today. I mean, I find it amazing. Here we sit and look at this rubble, what we would say is rubble. This was the center of civilization. And now it's rubble. Do with that as you might. It was originally 6 feet high and 15 feet in diameter. And now this is all that remains. Umbilicus Urbis Romae. Another very significant spot was the Via Sacra, or Sacred Road. This provided the setting for solemn religious festivals, as well as the magnificent triumph of victorious generals. When Roman generals returned victorious to Rome, they would have a triumph or a major parade that would end up at the Via Sacra. Interestingly, up until the time of Julius Caesar, they always had to leave their armies outside of Rome. So the triumph was generally just the generals, the victorious general, his officers, etc., and often captured booty, etc. But they would march down the Via Sacra. It was a very and a religious ceremony of military victory. In fact, and it was also on this, along this way, where they had what is known as the apotheosis ceremony, to which deceased Roman emperors were formally deified. When Roman emperors, as we get to the latter part after the Republic, all the emperors after their death were made gods. They were all deified. Some even claimed to be gods during that lifetime. And so there, in addition, there were numerous temples to the various gods. And the most major of those temples was the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximum, which no longer exists. But here's a model of what people, scholars, think it actually looked like. It was the foremost temple on Capitoline Hill, largest temple in the city and dedicated to the previously mentioned Capitoline triad or triad, the Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. It was like a cathedral. It had that sort of status in the official religion of Rome. It was destroyed by fire 3 times and then rebuilt in contemporary styles. But when Rome was sacked by the Vandals in 455, that's when Rome actually then fell as a major city. A lot of the stone was removed during the Renaissance and by the Vandals. And all we have left today is this. You can visit the temple foundations in a museum that is located on the site. Again, this magnificent temple, one of the largest in the Roman Empire. This is what is left. We do have a pretty good idea, though, from other temples throughout the empire as to how the inner structure looked. This is actually a temple in Douga, Tunisia. Somebody's sitting on the steps there. I'm not sure who that is. But what you see here, do you see there's a niche right in the middle there? That's where a statue of Jupiter would have gone. To the right of that on your screen would have been one of Juno, and to the left, one of Minerva. So here's another front view of a model of what they think this temple looked like. First annual meetings of the Senate occurred at the temple. So this brought religion and politics together. Incoming magistrates made sacrifices to Jupiter before they could be made officially senators. All the great triumphal processions that we mentioned ended here at this temple. Acts of state were announced at the temple, and it was an important repository of records, historical records, as well as something known as the Sibylline oracles. This was a collection of oracular texts which contained predictions related to the history of Rome. If you know anything about ancient Greece, this was something very similar at Delphi, where you would go and a priestess acting sort of as a prophetess would give predictions of things to come. And so this was what many of the Roman senators, magistrates would look at these oracles before they would make decisions of state. And these were housed in the temple of Jupiter. There were 14 books, and actually it's really interesting. Here's a fragment of one of them on the right, or at least a copy of one of those fragments. Another major temple was the Pantheon. Pantheon meaning temple of all gods. It was commissioned by Marcus Agrippa during the reign of Augustus, 27 BCE to 14 CE. Now, the picture you see here is modern, and this has been totally reconstructed, but refurbished a number of times. And there's a reason why it has remained in this condition. And that was because in 609, the Byzantine emperor gave the building to the Pope, Pope Benedict Boniface IV, who then converted it to a church. And so it became a Christian church. But originally, it was the temple of all gods in Rome. And here's a picture of the interior. And here's one of the dome. So then, in addition to this temple to Jupiter and the Capitoline Triad, there was the temple of Mars Ultor. He was the fourth. If we had to rank the gods, Mars was the fourth. Generally referred to as a god of war, was seen as most Romans as the god who defended the city. So war and defense came together. And this is the remains here on the left of the temple of Mars Ultor in the Forum. It was constructed in 42 BCE after the Battle of Philippi, in which the first emperor, Augustus, defeated Mark Antony. And this was the temple he built to Mars as a thanks, I guess, for the victory which made him emperor. And the building then became a place where all important military decisions were made. Again, so connecting religion with the military. For example, Augustus decreed that it should be the meeting place for the Senate. Normally, the Senate had its own meeting place. But if the Senate was ever going to meet regarding the question of war, they met here. They met here at this temple. It was also here that young Roman males were ceremoniously given their adult toga. And once they were given their adult toga, this meant they were eligible for military service. Then there was the Temple of Vesta, which was also located in the Forum. Here we see a statue of Vesta on the left and the remains of her temple today. Vesta was the goddess of the hearth, and the Roman community put special premium on the ever-burning hearth fire, both publicly and privately maintained. Within the temple of Vesta, there was an eternal flame, as it were. It was kept burning by the Vestal virgins, and I'll get to the Vestal virgins in a moment. But also, each home had a hearth where the fire was meant to be kept burning. And if it went out, either publicly or individually, this was seen as a bad omen. It was something you did not want to happen. So especially in the Temple of Vesta, there had to be those who watched over that fire continuously. And like I say, her worship was also observed in every household. And here we have a model of what that sacred flame must have looked like. Also within the temple was something called the Palladium. What was the Palladium? This was a statue of Minerva or Athena, believed to have been brought back from Troy by Aeneas, connecting Troy with Rome. Why was that important? Well, if you've ever read the Aeneid by Virgil, which is the story of Aeneas, Rome connects itself with Troy in order to get historical vengeance on the Greeks, because it was seen that the Greeks conquered Troy in a way that wasn't, we might call, upright. They had to do it in a sneaky fashion, because the idea was that of Odysseus, to bring that horse in with the troops and say, we're leaving, have your ships go out to sea. A wild party takes place in Troy. They're all drunk. The soldiers come back and Troy falls. This was then later, this revenge, as it were given for reason that Rome conquered Greece, to give a historical justification. So this Palladium, which was said to have come from Troy, was the linkage between Troy and Rome. Next to the temple was the house of the Vestal virgins. They were priestesses who cultivated and protected, as I said, the sacred fire. They were free from the usual social obligations to marry and bear children. They took a 30-year vow of chastity to devote themselves to the observance of state rituals. And this is very likely where the idea of nuns or sisters in the Roman Catholic Church came from, the Vestal virgins. They were, if you want to put it this way, married to Rome, just as sisters in the Catholic Church will be married to Jesus. They did not marry individually. In fact, if any of the Vestal virgins were found to be having improper sexual relations, the result was not a good one. Let's put it that way. Okay, so that's the ancient pagan heritage. Let's now move to the Christian heritage. Oh, this is the sacred grove outside of the house where many of the Vestal virgins were buried. Okay, let's move to the Christian side of Rome. And here we can see 3 of the early symbols of Christianity. Do you notice anything? What's not there? There's no cross. The early symbols were the fish, the bird, and the lamb. The cross only comes as a major symbol in the 4th century under Constantine. Okay, so what's the connection? The origin of Christianity in Rome is really not known. But the history of Christianity is fairly well documented. The influence of the apostles, or the Peter and Paul, undoubtedly impacted the history of Roman Christianity. According to tradition, following his 30-year ministry in the East, Peter, that's on the left, St. Peter's, yes, is believed to have established his quarters at Rome, where he was eventually martyred. Of course, in the New Testament, we have the epistle writings of Paul to the Christians in Rome. And again, tradition reports he went to Rome, where he was beheaded under the orders of the Emperor Nero. Now, during the first century, many of the Roman Christians were periodically persecuted, not openly as hostile as some of the traditions seem to say, but they often received blame for anything that went wrong, from plagues to economic inflation to hostile invasion by barbarians. Large-scale persecution, or larger scale, took place to some degree under the emperors Nero and Domitian. And then after 3 centuries, this hostility ended with the reforms of Emperor Constantine, who was responsible for legalizing Christianity throughout the Roman Empire. And then in 380, the Emperor Flavius Theodosius made Christianity the official religion of the empire. And many people say this was a major turning point in the history of Christianity, because Christianity went from a religion persecuted to a state religion with power to persecute. In any case, one of the earliest sacred sites in Rome, and still today, are known as the catacombs. What were the catacombs? These were underground burial places, of which there are at least 40 throughout the city. They were occasioned by the ancient Roman ban on burials within a city, and also as a response to sometimes to persecution, but not so much, more overcrowding and shortage of land. Going back, do you see on the right here in this hall, this is all underground. Do you see in these wires on the right, do you see what's in there? Can you tell? Those are bones. These are burial sites. Worship also took place, but they were effectively burial sites for the early Christians. The most famous of the Roman catacombs is known as the Catacomb of Calixtus. It's located in a park along the Appian Way. The Appian Way was the major road that led into Rome. Again, you can see these niches in the wall. That's where bodies, the remains of bodies, would be kept. It was also, and it's been a wonderful place to find early Christian art. The next 3 slides here will show examples. So on the left here, we have Jesus. On the right, probably some form of the Last Supper, or at least Jesus with a number of followers. Then on the left, we have Jesus as the Lamb of God. And on the right, probably an early Eucharist. You see the cup, the chalice. And then on the left, the fish, again, which was a powerful ancient Christian symbol, with what appears to be a cup or a chalice on top of it. And then just to show you that the art also goes back to the Hebrew Bible, we have Adam and Eve. All of these are found in the catacombs. If you do go to Rome, hopefully you can get a trip down into one of these catacombs. Very interesting sacred site.
Excuse me, Bill, weren't they also hiding places for the Christians?
Well, it was initially, it was places where Christians could go during time. I think Reverend Albert talked about this before. It's the idea of early Christian persecution is a little bit overdone in general. Um, they were seen as a cult, to be quite honest, who, as long as they didn't cause any real problems, there were a couple emperors, Nero and Domitian, who were there were persecutions. They did have some worship in the catacombs, and they could go down there, but the Romans knew where they were. I mean, it wasn't like these places could be easily hidden. So generally, they were underground places for burial, because burial was not allowed in the city. Then there's this interesting church of Santa Maria della Concezione dei Cappuccini. Will everyone repeat that in their best of Italian accents? What's famous, this ties in with the catacombs because of a famous crypt beneath this church, was by the Capuchin crypt, or the Capuchin, where we got cappuccino from the Capuchin monks. And it was the bone chapel. What was the, well, I guess you can guess what the bone chapel is. It contains the skeletal remains of 3,700 bodies, believed to be Capuchin friars buried by their order. Now, Chris and I, when we were in Prague, went outside of the city to visit something very similar, a church where you found just all these bones and skeletons. Okay. The order insists that the display is not meant to be macabre, but a silent reminder of the swift passage of life on earth and our own mortality. This, unless you're cremated, is where you're all going to end up. Not in this place, but in this form. Okay, in terms of sacred space, there's probably no more famous site in the Western world than St. Peter's Basilica. And here it is in the heart of Vatican City. Basilica, if you're interested, is a canonical title of honor given to a church building or buildings that are distinguished either by their antiquity or by their role as international centers of worship, because of their association with a major saint or a major historical event. So this is St. Peter's Basilica. It's built in Renaissance style. It's located in Vatican City, and it's the papal enclave that is within the city of Rome. It was initially planned by Popes Nicholas V and Julius II to replace an old St. Peter's Basilica that sat on this site, which had been built in the 4th century by the Emperor Constantine. And according to tradition, St. Peter was crucified in Rome, and some years later, a small shrine was erected at that site. That was the original St. Peter's. 300 years later, the old basilica, or the new basilica, was constructed over the site of the old. And that began in 1506 and was completed in 1626. So 120 years. Imagine if we built, if we were going to have a new building and said it was going to take 120 years to build. No one would build. We need things up quickly. The classic example is the cathedral in Milan, which took several centuries to complete. So it was the process of building it. You may remember that the funds to raise to help build the new St. Peter's came from the selling of indulgences. And you may remember that the selling of indulgences led to the German Augustinian priest. He was an Augustinian monk. He wrote to the archbishop. arguing against the selling of indulgences, and this became one of the major starting points for the Reformation and the birth of Protestantism. So just a few, back up here, just a few dimensions. The length, 720 feet. Width, 490 feet. Height, 448 feet. And here we see a photograph of the nave. It was decorated by Gian Lorenzo Bernini, who was commissioned by Pope Innocent X in 645 to complete the decoration of ornamental columns and chapels. Between the columns are two sequences of niches. You can't see them here quite clearly, which contain 39 statues of the founders of religious orders placed here at the beginning of the 18th century. And here is the apse, which is the semicircular recess, which is covered by a semi-dome above, and is generally located, the altar is generally located just under that. So you can see the altar and the apse. And the basilica contains numerous chapels and altars that go along the side. Here's what is known as the choir chapel. And it looks like here there is a marriage taking place. Then there's the chapel of Saint Sebastian, named after the mosaic behind the altarpiece, behind the altar. Then there's the altar of the Immaculate Conception. So what is the Immaculate Conception? Now, I know Reverend Albert has referred to this before, but it's well worth referring to because many people, if you say the Immaculate Conception, they think you're referring to Jesus. No, the Immaculate Conception is the belief that the Virgin Mary was born free of original sin. Do you see why that has to follow? If Jesus is born of Mary and she has any taint of sin, and Jesus is sinless, well, the two don't fit. So this is the altar of the Immaculate Conception. It was a problem, it was debated for centuries. And it was only in 1854 when Pope Pius IX gave it the status of dogma in a papal bull that the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception is considered infallible. You know, we think of people talk about the infallibility of the Pope. Well, the Pope can't just do anything he wants. His power of infallibility is over doctrine. If he claims that a certain doctrine, and he's only done that twice, and both, I mean, not he, but it's only been done twice, both in the 19th century, and both related to Mary. One, the Immaculate Conception, and later, the raising of Mary. So it's interesting. The Pope is infallible, yes, but only over doctrinal matters, and it's only been exercised twice. So here's the dome. Like I said, 448, and if you want exact, 448.1 feet from the floor of the basilica to the top of the cross, which you can see at the top. It is the tallest dome in the world. In its internal diameter, here's an interior of the dome, 136.1 feet. 0.1 seems to have been a popular number. And here, of course, is a view from the dome. It's quite a hike up that dome. I'd only If you're in pretty good shape, you might want to take it, but this is the beautiful view from that dome. There are over 100 tombs within St. Peter's, many located in the crypt beneath the basilica, the papal crypt. These include 91 popes. Who was the latest? John Paul II, April 8th, 2000. There are also numerous works of art, perhaps the most famous being Michelangelo's Pieta. I know when we were in Italy and you're just roaming the countryside in little villages, you'll find small little statues of this everywhere. Nothing, of course, at this standard or beauty, but there the Pieta, Mary with her son. And then there's St. Peter's Square, known as the Piazza di San Pietro. The present arrangement was constructed between 1656 and 1667. It's the inspiration of Bernini again, who inherited the location by what was already there, this Egyptian obelisk. You see it here? It's known as the Witness. It's 83 feet in height. So the obvious question is, why is it known as the Witness? Because it stood in the Circus of Nero in 37 CE, where it is thought to have witnessed the crucifixion of St. Peter. And that's why we find it in St. Peter's Square. And then, of course, another sacred Christian site is the Sistine Chapel, located in the Apostolic Palace in Vatican City and the official residence of the Pope. Originally known as the Cappella Magna, or the Great Chapel, it was built between 1473 and began in 1473. I don't have the finishing date, by Pope Sixtus IV. And since that time, it has served as a place both of religious as well as functionary papal activity. So it's not just for religious activity. A lot of the politics of the Vatican take place in this chapel. It is actually this is where the papal conclave meets when a new pope is selected. Its fame, however, comes from its decoration and frescoes. Here, of course, is the famous ceiling. And its two most famous pieces, Michelangelo's The Creation of Man, and his Last Judgment. So another basilica in Rome, second largest after St. Peter's, is known as the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls. So named because of its location outside of the Aurelian walls, which were built in 275 that encircled the 7 hills that you saw earlier. Marcus Aurelius built those. This basilica is outside of those walls, and it's dedicated to St. Paul. Built on what is known or claimed to be the burial ground of St. Paul. So when Paul was executed, his followers built a shrine over his grave. In 324, a small church was consecrated on the same grounds. And then a larger basilica was built, and it was completed in the last part of the 4th century. It was destroyed by fire in 1823, so that's why this basilica is relatively modern. And it was completed in 1840. Here's the exterior door with various scenes from Christian history. And here's the interior. And it houses some very famous mosaics that date back to the 13th century. Here's the apse mosaic. In December of 2006, it was announced that Vatican archaeologists had confirmed the presence of a white marble sarcophagus beneath the altar. Perhaps containing the remains of the Apostle Paul, perhaps. Then in 2009, the Pope announced that radiocarbon dating confirmed that the bones in the tomb dated from the 1st century, suggesting that they were or are indeed Paul's. Again, we don't know for sure. But if you've ever been to a major cathedral in Europe, you'll notice that nearly all of them will have some famous relic. When we were in, where were we, Chris, where we saw the arm of St. John the Baptist. I think that was in, where was that? It wasn't Milan. Milan has a famous shroud. I'll think of it as we go along. So, as you well know, and as we've mentioned, the Catholic tradition has long venerated Mary as the Mother of God. And thus many churches have been built in her honor, including this famous Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore. Maggiore means greater or superior. Santa Maria Maggiore was one of the first churches built in the honor of the Virgin Mary. It was erected in the immediate aftermath of the Council of Ephesus in 431, which for the first time proclaimed Mary as the Mother of God. So it wasn't until the 5th century that that was proclaimed. Pope Sixtus III, here we have, consecrated it to commemorate this decision. The church retains the core of its original structure, despite several additional construction projects as a result of a damage by earthquake in 1348. This basilica is often used by the Pope. He presides over the rites for the annual Feast of the Assumption of Mary. That's the other doctrine that I was referring to, the Assumption, meaning Mary was assumed into heaven. And that takes place on August 15th. So the Pope will be here every August 15th to celebrate that feast. And except for a few priests and maybe the basilica's archpriest, the high altar in this basilica is reserved for use only by the Pope alone. So it's a very important basilica, Basilica di Mary Maggiore. In fact, right after his election as Pope, this was one of the first basilicas to which Pope Francis went. So let's take a closer look at some of the, here's the exterior facade. Here's the interior. Here's the apse. Notice the mosaic. Another famous mosaic held in the church. One of its most famous chapels is the Borghese Chapel. The chapels run along the side. If you're walking down the nave, on the sides, you will find these chapels, which are the size of many churches. It is known as the Salus Populi Romani, or salvation of the Roman people, because of the icon found within. Tradition claims a miracle in which the icon reportedly helped keep plague out of the city. It's at least 1,000 years old, and according to tradition was painted, again, according to tradition, Saint Luke the Evangelist, using the wooden table in Nazareth of the Holy Family. That's the tradition. And it is a very holy icon. Under the high altar of the basilica is what is known as the crypt of the Nativity, or the Bethlehem crypt. It's a crystal reliquary said to contain wood from the holy crib of Jesus. So again, if you go to any major cathedral in Europe, Catholic, you will find generally a relic of some sort. And it's not only, you not only find relics in Christianity. The great Buddhist stupas all claim to have relics related to the Buddha. It's as if there's some need for a physical incarnation of something holy, not just something abstract. Under the altar, we also find a number of burial sites, the most famous perhaps being that of Saint Jerome from the 4th century. He was a doctor of the church, known for his translation of the Bible into Latin, or what we call the Vulgate. His remains were brought to the basilica in the 12th century and placed next to the reliquary that we just saw. Another sacred site related to Mary is the minor basilica of Santa Maria Trastevere, named after a suburb in Rome. The first sanctuary was built in 221, later completed in 340, thus making it one of the oldest churches in Rome. Here we see the interior and this magnificent ceiling on the right. Here's the apse. Imagine the work that went into this. I mean, this takes some sort of dedication. Nobody signed it. Nobody said, this is my work. I mean, we know who some of the artists were, of course, who directed a lot of this, but those who worked on it, they did it out of dedication. And then inside the church, there is a unique icon of the enthroned Virgin and Child. It's known as the Madonna della Clemenza. It's a panel painting dated between the 6th and 9th century, probably of Byzantine origin. It's one of the 5 oldest existing Marian icons from the medieval period. The church also contains a number of important mosaics from the late 13th century. Here's one by Pietro Cavallini of the Annunciation. One of Rome's most sacred relics is found in another minor basilica known as St. Peter in Chains. The church was rebuilt on an older foundation, 432 to 440, to house the relic of the chains that bound St. Peter when he was imprisoned in Jerusalem. It is said that the Empress Eudoxia, who was the wife of Emperor Valentinian III, and had received them as a gift, then presented the chains to Pope Leo I, whose papacy was 440 to 461. According to legend, when Leo compared them to the chains of Peter's final imprisonment in the Mamertine prison, which is in Rome, and here you see the outside and the altar within that prison where Peter was said to be held, the two chains miraculously fused together. And they're now kept in the reliquary under the basilica's main altar. If you can see the chains there, the chains that bound Peter. The church is also known for another famous artistic piece by Michelangelo, and that's his Moses, which is part of the tomb of Pope Julius II. So here you get on the left a view from the tomb from a little bit of a distance, and here a close-up of the famous Moses. Okay, and finally, I know we're running a little bit over, but finally, let's return to St. Paul by visiting the Tréfontaine Abbey. It's inhabited by monks of the Cistercian order of the strict observance, better known as Trappists. If any of you know of the monk Thomas Merton, he was a Trappist. It contains actually 3 separate churches, the most well-known being the Church of St. Paul of the Three Fountains. It was raised on the spot where St. Paul was said to have been beheaded by the Emperor Nero. Legend accounts for the 3 springs or fontaines with the assertion that when severed from his body, his head bounced and struck the earth in 3 different places, from which 3 fountains sprang up. These still flow and are located in the sanctuary. So here you see one of those springs. And here we see a pilgrim at one of those springs or fountains. Okay, so that brings us to a conclusion. Next week, we'll be traveling to Jerusalem, where we will see holy sites from Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So at that point, why don't I stop sharing? And if we have any questions or thoughts or comments. Let's see if I can get rid of this.
Bill, is the Sistine Chapel in the back of the St. Peter's Basilica?
It's around the corner. Yeah, it's in Vatican City, but it's not part of the cathedral of the basilica per se. It's a separate. It's the Pope's residence, but it's of course it's known for its Michelangelo's art, but it's also where every new Pope is reelected. It's where the white smoke comes up.
And it has a dome. It has a dome.
Yeah, small.
It's Thank you.
Thoughts, comments?
Well, I realize that when you put a building on something, you're claiming the ground or you're claiming the concept. It just seemed like everything had to have a building.
Yeah, that was that was one way of establishing sacred space
And authority.
and authority. Yep, authority and sacred space. Yes. Mhm.
It seemed like it also made tradition, or so we say, real.
Yes, it was concrete. I mean, it was concrete. Yeah, this when you go to these places, to me, regardless of the religion, there's a feeling about them, especially when they're old, and just you imagine all the people that have been into those sacred places and have held them as sacred. And yeah, to me, it just gives me sometimes a shiver.
Also that they're so massive
Yeah,
and so ornate.
Yeah.
Every little square inch is decorated and
Yeah.
in gold half the time.
Yeah.
They're awesome.
Yeah. It's and we, like I say, we've been to a number of the basilicas throughout Italy and France and cathedrals, and there's just something sacred about them. At least that's the feeling I get. It's different than going into a mall, which is sort of our sacred buildings. Or we build buildings for banks and financial institutions. It's interesting. It's often said you can tell the core values of a culture by what's the tallest building. What's the tallest building? Most of ours are bank related, insurance related. Whereas in the Middle Ages, it was the cathedral. That was the spot.
By the World Trade Center was such
Yeah.
object.
Carol?
Yeah. At St. Paul's Basilica, the statue of St. Paul is with a sword. Was he known for, why is he's got a sword? Was he just to indicate he was a strong person? I wasn't too sure.
Yeah, it probably had dual functions. One, the sword was power, but this happens in other religious traditions too. The sword can also be the sword that kills one's ego.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's not just the sword for out there. It's the sword that kills the ego. There's a famous Hindu mystic poetess, Mirabai, who often speaks of the sword of cutting her own throat. Now, she's meaning cutting the throat of her ego to become one with Krishna. Or if you see the images of Kali with the skulls and the sword, that's not supposed to be external. That's supposed to be killing the ego. If you want to become one with Brahman, if you want to become one with the Christ nature, if you want to become one with Allah, the one thing that has to be killed is your ego. And that's in all the traditions. And what better for referring to that than a sword? As long as you understand that that's the central message.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I am struck by how old many of those buildings are.
Yeah.
Before the Christian era, and they haven't sunk. The walls haven't collapsed inward on them. I think it speaks to an engineering knowledge.
Oh, yeah. Well, the Romans were, if nothing, great engineers. If you look at their aqueduct systems, the engineering is incredible for the time. They could measure with relatively simple tools, or the flow of the land, that you have to know exactly if you're going to bring water from one place to another. Again, when we were in Tunisia, we visited a Roman aqueduct that took water down into Carthage and Tunis. It went 24 miles.
You had to know the slope.
You had to know the slope, and you had to, and it was just incredible. They were great, and the roads that they built. Now the roads were, largely built for commerce and military, but the roads united that empire. And so, yes, they were wonderful engineers. And they knew how to build buildings. But like we say, if you look, no matter how well you build those, eventually, if they're not taken care of and refurbished over time, they're going to collapse.
Yeah.
You know, so yeah, that's why I always like to speak of those ruins. You got to imagine what they were initially. You see the model of what they think it looked like, and then you see what remains. And that's what eventually happens, unless they're refurbished over time. And of course, there was no desire to refurbish pagan temples. In fact, many of and this happens again, it isn't just Christians, it happened with Muslims and Hindus. You often, if you've conquered some area, you build your religious site where theirs was.
Mhm.
Now, this has come back to bite in modernity, because a lot of groups are now saying that sacred site that is there was once ours.
And I want it.
The Temple Mount is a classic example, and we'll be seeing that next week in Jerusalem. The Temple Mount, of course, was where the Jewish two temples were, the Temple of Solomon and the Temple of Herod. What's up there now? A mosque and the Dome of the Rock. And conflict is continual between those two religions over that sacred space. Whereas if you can perhaps see sacred space not as a physical thing, but an internal thing, then there's no problem. But we tend to want to concretize our sacred experiences. Same in major riots that took place about a decade ago in India over the destruction of parts of a mosque that Hindus claimed had been built over the temple of Rama. And that went to court, and now there are two separate sites. The court decided, you get this part, you get this part. Okie doke. Thanks for showing up today. We'll continue next week with Jerusalem, and follow that with Damascus, and then Varanasi for our 4 sacred sites. So again, thanks for showing up today, and hopefully see you next week.
Thanks, Bill.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.